Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going on a journey to Yemen, a country with a fascinating history and some really complex power dynamics.
Absolutely.
And we've got these two super interesting academic papers to help us unpack it all. One looks back in time, exploring the history of power structures in Yemen.
Hmm.
And the other uses this really unique lens, something called critical genocide studies, to examine the current conflict. So we're going to try to piece together how power has been, acquired and wielded in Yemen and what that all means, for the conflict today and the chances for peace down the road. It's a lot to unpack, but I think it'll be really fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. And you can't really understand where Yemen is today without looking at its past. I mean, Yemen's history has always been about decentralized power structures. Tribes, have always had a huge influence.
Oh, totally. It's like even thinking back to the ancient Yemeni states, like the Sabaeans and Himyarites. Those were basically just coalitions of powerful tribes, right?
That's correct.
And that's so different from how we usually picture ancient states, We usually think of them as having these strong central authorities, but Yemen seems to have always done things a bit differently. It makes you wonder how much those ancient power structures are still kind of echoing today,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Even when the modern Yemeni Republic was established in 1962, real power sharing remained super elusive.
So this idea of power sharing, or rather the lack of it, it's a bit of a recurring theme, huh? Like every new regime from North and South Yemen, even to the unified republic, everyone has wrestled with this.
It's true. And this winner-take-all approach, it often leads to what's called a stateless regime. Basically, it's like a powerful elite taking control of all the resources and sidelining everyone else. It's a pattern we see over and over again in Yemen's history, and it really contributes to this cycle of instability and conflict.
Okay, so to get a clearer picture of how all of this actually played out, let's take a little walk through some of the key moments in Yemen's more recent history. What are some of those turning points?
Well, even before unification, both North and South Yemen had their own set of coups and power struggles.
Oh, wow. So both sides were already dealing with these power dynamics even before they came together as one nation. No wonder the unified republic also struggled. Sounds like a recipe for, more the same.
Yeah, exactly. Both North and South Yemen had their own internal struggles and shifts in power. For example, in North Yemen, there was a coup in 1962, and then another one in 1974. South Yemen wasn't immune either.
It's almost like they inherited this baggage of power struggles from both sides.
Right. And this pattern of instability and marginalization, it ultimately led to the violent conflicts that have really plagued Yemen,
Yeah.
This lack of stable power-sharing mechanisms has left the country incredibly vulnerable.
Okay, so speaking of instability, let's talk about Ali Abdullah Saleh, who ruled for over 30 years. He kind of projected this image of democracy, holding elections and all that. But behind the scenes, it seems like he was really pulling all the strings.
Yeah, definitely. He was very much a master manipulator.
It's wild how he relied heavily on his own tribe, the Sanha Nasheed, to fill key positions in government and the security forces. That doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for fair representation.
Yeah, it wasn't. And it created this breeding ground for opposition groups. Saleh created what we call a clientelist system. He used elections to legitimize his rule, but then he strategically used state resources, even manipulated wars, to really consolidate his power.
And I imagine that this favoritism towards his own tribe didn't exactly sit well with a lot of people.
It definitely created resentment. And in fact, some of these groups that opposed him would later become major players in the conflict we see today. So even though his tactics were effective in maintaining his grip on power, they ultimately ended up sowing the seeds for future instability.
It's fascinating, but also kind of tragic how these power plays can have these long-term consequences. And then in 2011, the Arab Spring uprising swept across the region, forcing Saleh to finally step down. It felt like a real turning point for Yemen, a chance to break free from this, cycle of authoritarian rule.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah. But it sounds like things didn't exactly go as planned.
Well, Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi took over. He promised power sharing, but unfortunately he ended up falling into that same trap of consolidating power for himself.
So even with Saleh out of the picture, the old patterns persisted.
Yeah, pretty much. Hadi, despite his promises of change, repeated the mistakes of his predecessors. He tried to sideline Saleh's family and supporters, which just fueled tensions further. And his missteps with the Houthis, those ended up contributing to the conflict we see raging today.
Right, the Houthis. They've gone from this religious revivalist movement to a major political and military force in Yemen. It's a pretty remarkable transformation. How did they manage to gain so much power?
They were smart. They understood the deep dissatisfaction many Yemenis felt towards the traditional elite. Instead of working through existing power structures, they appealed directly to individuals within the tribes, tapping into that discontent and forging their own alliances.
So they kind of bypassed the traditional power brokers and went straight to the people.
Yeah, you could say that. And it worked. Once they captured Sanahau, the capital, they quickly established their own system of control, which they called the supervisor system.
I've heard of that, but I don't know much about it. What was it exactly?
Well, it was basically a parallel authority structure. It gave them direct control over resources and allowed them to suppress any dissent. It's pretty sad, really. They were essentially replicating those same power-grabbing tactics of previous regimes, concentrating power within their own inner circle.
It seems like this never-ending cycle of power consolidation, no matter who comes out on top. And speaking of groups vying for power, we can't forget the Southern Transitional Council, the STC. They're all about an independent South Yemen, but they've also engaged in some pretty questionable tactics to consolidate their own power, haven't they?
Definitely. Things like banning the unity flag and setting up their own elite trade networks. These moves alienated potential allies in the South. Instead of broadening their base of support, they pushed people away, which just further fragmented the political landscape.
It's a shame, really. You'd think that in a country as fractured as Yemen, building coalitions and unity would be super important for any kind of lasting peace. But instead, it seems like everyone's just scrambling for power, even if it means pushing others away. And all of this is happening against this backdrop of a devastating war, It feels like history is repeating itself, but with even higher stakes.
It is.
And that brings us to this second source we have, which examines the conflict in Yemen through the lens of something called critical genocide studies.
Yeah.
Now, this is a really interesting approach because it challenges our assumptions about what actually constitutes genocide. And it argues that certain atrocities, like what we're seeing in Yemen, often get kind of, hidden or forgotten simply because they don't fit neatly into our preconceived ideas of what genocide actually is.
And it's a really important point.
But before we dive into that, let's take a step back and look at the conflict itself. We've got a lot of actors on the stage. The Houthis, the STC, and of course the Saudi-led coalition.
Right, and understanding each of their motivations and actions is key to really unpacking this whole thing.
Yeah, totally. We've already talked a bit about the Houthis and the STC, so let's turn our attention to the Saudi-led coalition. What's their story? What are their stated goals? And how have their actions impacted the situation on the ground?
So the Saudi-led coalition got involved back in 2015. They claimed their main goal was to restore President Hadi's internationally recognized government, and of course to counter Iranian influence, which they saw happening through the Houthis. But their intervention pretty quickly escalated into a full-blown war.
And I'm guessing this escalation had a major impact on the Yemeni people.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Saudi-led coalition's air campaign has been devastating. It's involved extensive bombing, including civilian areas, and then there's the blockade, which has been crippling. It's severely restricted the flow of essential goods. It's created a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale that's really hard to comprehend.
It's hard to even wrap your head around it all. We've got this conflict that's been raging for years, with all these different groups fighting for power, this humanitarian crisis unfolding, and just immense suffering. It's a heavy situation. And it's really important that we understand all the nuances and all the different perspectives involved, right?
Absolutely. And that's where critical genocide studies comes in. It pushes us to look at the conflict through a different lens, to challenge our own assumptions, and to, confront some uncomfortable truths.
Okay, so let's dive into all of that in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll explore what exactly critical genocide studies is and how it applies to this war in Yemen.
Welcome back. So we've been talking about power dynamics in Yemen, tracing those roots through history and right into the current conflict. Now, we're going to look at this idea of forgotten atrocities, using that lens of critical genocide studies.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic, but an important one. And you mentioned earlier that this approach really challenges how we think about what actually makes something a genocide. Most people, I think, when they hear that word genocide, they immediately picture something like the Holocaust, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty common association, and for good reason, of course. The Holocaust was horrific, this systematic attempt to wipe out an entire group of people. But critical genocide studies argues that this very specific image, often shaped by the Holocaust, can actually prevent us from seeing other forms of mass violence that might not fit that exact mold.
So are you saying that because the war in Yemen isn't driven by, like, explicitly racist ideology, it somehow doesn't count?
It's not about saying it doesn't count. It's more about asking tough questions about how we as a global community perceive and respond to different types of violence. Critical genocide studies argues that there's this dominant way of thinking about genocide, what they call the hegemonic concept. And this concept often really focuses on intent. Like, did the perpetrators actually set out to destroy an entire group of people?
Okay, but what about the consequences? I mean, the blockade and the bombing campaign, they've had a devastating impact on Yemen, even if it wasn't, explicitly planned a genocide in that very specific way.
That's a crucial point. Critical genocide studies forces us to consider the impact, the consequences of actions, regardless of what the intent might have been. Just because a conflict doesn't fit perfectly into that hegemonic concept, it doesn't mean that the suffering is any less real. It doesn't mean it's any less worthy of our attention.
So it's like we have this blind spot. We think that if a conflict isn't fueled by a very specific kind of hatred, then it's somehow, I don't know, less of a genocide.
Yeah, you could put it that way. Think about it like this. Other conflicts, like the Rwandan genocide or the Bosnian War, they often fit more neatly into that hegemonic concept. There were clear ethnic or religious divisions, and the rhetoric, it often explicitly called for the extermination of a particular group. And that makes it, well, easier for people to categorize them as genocide. It's clear-cut.
But Yemen is messier, right? The Saudi coalition says they're all about security, about countering Iranian influence. They don't talk about extermination. They don't say they're targeting civilians. So it all kind of flies under the radar.
In a way, yeah. It
Yeah.
creates this plausible deniability. Without that blatant, genocidal rhetoric, it's easier to dismiss the suffering. It's easier to downplay how bad things really are.
And then there's the whole issue of the West's involvement. I mean, Western countries have been big supporters of the Saudi-led coalition, providing weapons, intelligence, you name it. It's like, how can you call it a genocide when you're actively supporting the people involved?
Yeah, the West's role in all of this definitely makes things more complicated. It makes it harder to hold anyone accountable when you have powerful nations essentially complicit in the violence.
And we can't forget about the media, right? The coverage of the war in Yemen has been, well, inconsistent at best. And when it is covered, it often focuses on the geopolitics of it all, rather than the human cost. It's like the world just hasn't been paying attention.
The media plays a huge role in shaping public perception. If the mainstream media isn't covering it, if we're not seeing the faces of the victims, it's really hard to get people outraged. It's hard to demand action. And that allows the conflict to just continue in the shadows.
And that's what's so heartbreaking. The suffering in Yemen is on a massive scale. Millions are facing starvation. The healthcare system is barely functioning. Countless lives have been lost. Yet it often feels like the world has moved on. It's just another forgotten war.
It's a tragedy on so many levels. The suffering itself, obviously, but also this lack of accountability, this indifference from the rest of the world. That's what critical genocide studies really pushes us to confront, this indifference. It asks us to see the victims, to recognize their humanity, to demand justice for the crimes that have been committed.
So it's not just an academic exercise, right? It's about recognizing the human cost of all of this and pushing for real change.
Exactly. It's about understanding how power, how ideology, how media narratives, how all of that comes together to shape how we see these conflicts, and ultimately how they shape our responses, or lack thereof.
I see what you mean. It encourages us to be more critical, to question what we're being told, to look beyond those simplistic explanations.
Yes. And by shining a light on these forgotten atrocities, by challenging the systems and structures that allow them to continue, well, hopefully we can start to change the narrative. We can start to create a more just world.
Okay, so we've talked about this idea of forgotten genocides, and it seems pretty clear that the war in Yemen fits into that category. We've seen how power dynamics have shaped Yemen's history, how they fueled this conflict, and how certain atrocities can get overlooked or downplayed. But what about the future? Is there hope for Yemen? Can they break this cycle of violence?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, there are no easy answers. But our first source, the one that delves into Yemen's history, it does offer some potential paths forward, ways to address those deep-rooted issues of power, and create a more stable, more just Yemen.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. The source mentioned decentralization as a key. You mentioned earlier how this winner-take-all approach has been a recurring problem. So could decentralization be a way to change that?
The idea is that if you spread power out more broadly, you make it harder for any one group to just take over everything. Instead of concentrating power at the top, you empower local communities and give them more control over their own governance.
So it's about shifting that balance of power, making the system more inclusive.
Right. And it's not a completely new idea for Yemen. Even under Saleh, there was some talk about decentralization, but it was never really implemented in any meaningful way.
So there's at least some precedent for this kind of approach. But how would it actually work in a country as, well, as fractured as Yemen? What would decentralization look like in practice?
It's definitely not a simple solution. There are a lot of potential challenges, for sure. But the author suggests a few key steps. The first is creating a broad, technocratic central government.
Technocratic. So run by experts, not politicians.
Exactly. And this government would have to include representatives from every major faction, including the Houthis.
Wow, that sounds, I don't know, almost impossible. Given the level of animosity between these groups, getting them to actually agree on anything seems like a huge task.
It would take a ton of effort, compromise, a willingness to put the past behind them. But the alternative, continued conflict and suffering, that's just, well, it's unacceptable.
Yeah, I get it. But even if they could form this unity government, how could they ensure that power is actually shared fairly, that resources are distributed equitably?
That's where the real work comes in. The author suggests a national economic committee made up of experts from all the different factions to oversee the distribution of resources. And to make sure everything is transparent and prevent corruption, this committee would operate under international oversight.
So the international community would play a big role, not just in pushing for a political solution, but also in making sure that solution actually works on the ground.
Yes, exactly. The international community has responsibility to support Yemen, not just in ending the war, but in building a stable, just future. That means financial assistance, expertise, and holding everyone accountable to their commitments.
Okay, so decentralization is one potential solution. But our source also mentioned federalism. Is that the same thing, or is there a difference?
It's a different concept, and it comes with its own set of opportunities and risks. In theory, federalism can promote power sharing and make things more equitable by dividing a country into regions, each with a certain degree of autonomy.
So kind of like a states' rights model, like each region gets to make its own rules on certain issues.
Yeah, sort of. But in Yemen, there's a real concern that a federal system could actually make those existing divisions even worse, that it could solidify those power imbalances that have fueled the conflict.
So instead of uniting the country, it could end up pulling it further apart. I can see how that could happen, especially given Yemen's history of regional rivalries and competition for resources.
Exactly. Imagine Yemen divided into regions, each with its own government, military, control over resources. It's easy to see how old tensions, tribal allegiances, that competition for power, it could all resurface, leading to new conflicts, more instability.
It's like creating mini Yemens within Yemen, each one replicating the same power struggles, but on a smaller scale.
And then you add in the complexities of the current conflict, all the different actors, the influence of outside powers. It just gets more and more challenging.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. So if federalism is so risky, why is it even on the table as a solution?
It's not that federalism is inherently bad. It's more about whether it's the right fit for Yemen, given its specific circumstances. And the author does point out that federalism was endorsed during the National Dialogue Conference back in 2013. But even then, there was a lot of disagreement on how to actually implement it.
Ah, yes, the National Dialogue Conference. It felt like a moment of hope at the time, a chance for Yemen to, find a new path. But it didn't really deliver on its promises. It's almost like a microcosm of the challenges facing the country, isn't it?
It really is. The failure of that conference highlights how limited top-down approaches to peacebuilding can be. You can't just force a solution, no matter how well-intentioned it might be, without addressing those underlying complexities, and without everyone actually buying into it.
Which brings us back to decentralization. It seems more organic, more in line with how Yemen has traditionally functioned, and maybe less likely to fall into those traps of federalism.
That's what the author argues, yeah. Decentralization focuses on empowering local communities, giving them more say in how things are run. It encourages a sense of ownership over the peacebuilding process. It's a bottom-up approach that recognizes that local knowledge and local solutions are key.
So it's not just about moving power from the national level to the regional level. It's about empowering communities at the grassroots.
Yeah, that's the idea. But of course, there are potential challenges with decentralization too. The big question is how to prevent local authorities from becoming new centers of power, from repeating the same patterns of corruption and exclusion.
So how do you make sure that decentralization doesn't just create a bunch of mini Salahs or mini Houthis, right?
Exactly. And that's where strong institutions are crucial. Decentralization can't just be about giving power away. It also has to be about building capacity at the local level, about promoting transparency, accountability, ensuring everyone has a voice.
So it's about changing how power is used, not just who holds it. Creating a system where it's shared, where resources are divided fairly, where every citizen feels like they have a stake in their community's future.
Yeah, that's well said. And it needs sustained commitment from the international community. Yemen can't do this alone.
It's a shared responsibility, right? Recognizing that peace and stability in Yemen aren't just good for Yemen, they're good for everyone. We're all connected, and instability in one part of the world can create ripple effects that reach far beyond its borders.
Absolutely. The conflict in Yemen has already had a huge impact on the entire region. It's contributed to instability, displacement, humanitarian crises. A peaceful, prosperous Yemen would benefit everyone, not just the Yemeni people.
Okay, so we've talked about solutions at the macro level: decentralization, federalism, the role of the international community. But I'm also curious about the micro level, What about the everyday lives of Yemenis? How has this war, this constant struggle for power, impacted them personally?
The human cost to this conflict is immeasurable. It's shattered lives, torn families apart, robbed an entire generation of their future. Millions of people have been displaced, forced to flee their homes. They end up in overcrowded camps or seeking refuge in neighboring countries.
It's hard to even imagine the trauma, the loss, that constant fear, the struggle to find food and water, the lack of basic health care.
And what makes it even more tragic is that a lot of this suffering could have been avoided. This is a man-made crisis, fueled by ambition, by greed, by this relentless pursuit of power.
It's a stark reminder that behind the headlines, behind all these discussions about power dynamics and solutions, there are real people whose lives have been completely upended.
Absolutely. And their stories need to be heard, their resilience, their courage in the face of all of this hardship. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the complexities of the conflict, but we have to remember the human cost. These are individuals, families, communities.
And that's why accountability is so important.
Yeah.
The people responsible for the atrocities, for targeting civilians, for using starvation as a weapon, they need to be held responsible.
It's about justice, but it's also about sending a message. These actions have consequences. Impunity isn't an option. It's about recognizing the humanity of the Yemeni people, their pain, their resilience, and their right to a peaceful future.
You're absolutely right. That needs to be at the forefront of any efforts to address this conflict and build a lasting peace.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm feeling a mix of emotions. Sadness, anger at the suffering, this feeling that the conflict is just so intractable. But there's also a bit of hope, a belief that change is possible, that a more just and peaceful future for Yemen isn't totally out of reach.
It's a complex situation, definitely.
Yeah.
But understanding the history, the root causes, the human cost, it allows us to start imagining a different path.
It's a reminder that knowledge is power. By shedding light on these forgotten atrocities, by demanding accountability, by working towards a more just and equitable world, we can make a difference.
And that's what this deep dive is all about. Understanding power, understanding conflict, understanding empathy, challenging ourselves to think critically, to question assumptions, and to really engage with the world around us.
Well said. So, in part 3 of our deep dive, we're going to look at some specific examples of how people are working to create positive change in Yemen. We'll discuss what we, as informed global citizens, can actually do to support those efforts. Welcome back to our deep dive on power dynamics in Yemen. It's been a pretty heavy conversation so far, right? We've gone from the historical roots of this conflict to just devastating human cost of the war as it is right now. But now I think it's time to look ahead. Is there hope for Yemen? Can this cycle of violence finally be broken? And what can we, as people who care about what's happening in the world, actually do to help bring about positive change?
Yeah, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed, right, when you think about all the challenges Yemen is facing. But even amidst all the despair, there were these amazing stories of, resilience, courage, and determination. There are people, individuals, and organizations working so hard to create a better future for Yemen, often putting themselves at risk to do it.
That's what I want to hear about, those stories, those people. Give us some examples of that work being done on the ground. What are people doing to address those root causes of the conflict, to rebuild their communities?
Well, one of the most promising areas is this focus on grassroots peace building. There are Yemeni activists, community leaders, and organizations that are working across those tribal and political divides, trying to foster dialogue, rebuild trust, find some kind of common ground.
So they're not waiting for politicians to strike a deal. They're taking matters into their own hands, working at the community level to heal those divisions and, I don't know, create a more peaceful society from the ground up.
Exactly. They're doing things like facilitating workshops, mediating disputes, creating spaces where people can come together and share their experiences. But it's not just about talking. They're also taking action.
Okay, give me an example. What does that action look like?
In some areas, you have local communities coming together to rebuild what's been destroyed by the war. They're repairing schools, hospitals, water systems. It shows that even with all the chaos, there's this deep desire for things to go back to normal, and this willingness to work together to make that happen.
It's powerful, these acts of, I don't know, defiance, this refusal to let the conflict totally define their lives, but it's got to be incredibly difficult to operate in a war zone. How do these peace builders manage to do this work when it's so dangerous?
It takes a lot of courage, a lot of dedication. These individuals are putting their lives at risk every single day just to promote peace and reconciliation. I mean, they face threats from all sides. Armed groups, those who profit from the conflict, even people within their own communities who just resist change.
It's really a testament to their commitment to peace that they keep going, Despite the risks, are there any particular organizations or people that stand out in this work?
Yeah, there are many, but one that's doing some really incredible work is the Marib Girls Foundation. They're focused on empowering young women in Yemen. Through education, leadership training, peace-building initiatives, they're equipping girls with the skills they'll need to become, agents of change in their communities.
That's so important, right? Investing in the next generation, giving them the tools to create a different future for Yemen. It gives me hope, knowing that even in the middle of all this darkness, there are people working to create a more just and equitable society.
They're not alone. There are also international organizations that are partnering with Yemeni organizations to provide humanitarian aid, support peace-building efforts, and advocate for a political solution to the conflict.
What are some ways these international groups are making a difference?
Well, groups like the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, they're providing essential medical care, food, water, often working in incredibly challenging conditions. They're also working to protect civilians who are caught in the crossfire, documenting human rights abuses, and advocating for, respect for international humanitarian law.
It's so important to have these organizations on the ground, providing a lifeline to those who are most vulnerable and holding everyone accountable for their actions. But at the end of the day, a real solution to this conflict has to be political, right? What progress has been made on that front?
There have been some encouraging signs. Back in 2022, a ceasefire agreement was reached. And while it's been fragile and there have been some violations, it did provide some relief from the violence and opened up a space for dialogue and negotiations.
So there's at least a chance, that Yemen can finally break free from this cycle of violence.
It's going to be a long road, for sure. And there are a lot of obstacles. There's a lot of mistrust between the different groups. And outside powers continue to exert their influence, often putting their own interests ahead of the needs of the Yemeni people.
Right. It's like a reminder that peace isn't just about signing pieces of paper. It's about addressing those underlying power dynamics, those root causes of the conflict. It's about creating a system where power is shared, resources are distributed fairly, and everyone in Yemen has a stake in their country's future.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial that the international community stays involved. To support peace building, hold all sides accountable to their commitments, and work towards a just solution that addresses the needs of all Yemenis.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the glimmers of hope, the work that's being done, but what about us? What can we, as, informed global citizens, actually do to help?
The first thing is just to stay informed. Don't let Yemen become another one of those forgotten wars. Read articles, follow reputable news sources, talk about it. The more we understand what's happening, the better equipped we are to advocate for change.
So it's about raising awareness, making sure the world doesn't look away from the suffering?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And you can support organizations that are working to help. The ones providing humanitarian assistance, those promoting peace building, those pushing for a political solution. Even a small donation can make a difference.
It's about putting what we know into action, right? Using our voices and our resources to support the people who are working for peace and justice in Yemen.
And never underestimate the power of speaking up. Contact your elected officials, write letters, use social media to raise awareness, and urge your government to prioritize a peaceful resolution.
So it's about holding our leaders accountable, demanding they prioritize diplomacy over, everything else, that they use their influence to push for a just and lasting peace. It's recognizing that we, as citizens of the world, have a responsibility to help create a more peaceful and just world for everyone.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, even small actions can have a big impact. Every voice that's raised, every dollar donated, every conversation about this, it all adds up to a growing movement for peace and justice in Yemen.
That's a powerful thought to end on. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the really complex world of power dynamics in Yemen, let's hold on to that hope, that belief that change really is possible. Let's commit to staying informed, supporting those working for peace, and using our own voices to advocate for a better future for the people of Yemen. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep diving deep.